You may. Okay. But, you know, my hope was that, we could have a conversation. I could put it on my podcast. I hope that's okay.
That's absolutely fine. You may certainly record it.
All right.
And if and we're not live, so that if something happens that one of us wants to, change something or not include something, I mean, we can always not publish too. I mean,
Okay.
so you mentioned that you found me. Your wife had been listening to. Well, let me get this too.
Yeah.
There we go. You mentioned that your wife had found my YouTube channel or my podcast, and that's how you ran across me.
Yeah, exactly. Um, yeah, I think it started with Paul Kingsnorth. She had
Okay.
read Savage Gods ages ago.
Okay.
And um, yeah, just through his, and I think she read something in the Free Press, sort of publishing his conversion story. And then
Okay.
she found you commenting on it, and she was like, "Oh, this is interesting." And she tried to get me to watch, and then um, you started, mentioning this word metagelical, and she was like, "Hey, have you heard of this word?" I'm like, "No." More or less, she was like, "I think you might be one of these kind of people." So
Your wife trying to figure out who you are, huh?
I
Years into
guess.
marriage.
Yeah, exactly. That's how it is. Um, but yeah, it's so interesting. And then I just started watching a bunch of random content that you've been
Yeah.
putting out. And um, as you may know, I was kind of deep in well, this would be part of an interesting conversation, but I was in loosely affiliated with the emergent world, but mainly just because of my proximity to Marcel, Grand Rapids,
Yep.
and being a part of it from day one, and then kind of coming and going, and eventually taking Rob's job. But from the inside, I don't think any of us, including Rob, were really all that concerned about where we fell in the larger map of what's happening to evangelical Christianity, what's happening to Christianity in general. Kind of held some of those conversations at arm's length, and I'm just like in a different place now, and I'm more curious. Like, wait, what the heck was I up to? And what were the patterns? What were the trends? And what's happening right now? And some of these other people that you've been interested in, like, well, I already mentioned Kingsnorth, but like Jordan Peterson and Vervaeke and these other voices, Peugeot. I mean, they're also now on my radar. And Martin Shaw, I've been following Martin Shaw for years, but like, oh, is there a convergence of worlds here? That's kind of how it feels to me. And so I just wanted to meet you and talk with you and like, who are you? What have you been doing? Uh,
Well,
what
this
are
will
you
be interesting
seeing?
because we'll have a journey of mutual discovery. I don't know who I. Well, maybe we'll start with me. Um, I am a third generation. And here's the thing: you live in Grand Rapids, or you've lived in
Hmm.
Grand Rapids, and so my wife, from the age of 13 on to till she went to Calvin College, lived in Wyoming, Michigan, and a
Hmm.
lot of her family lives in Grandville. So, but I am a third generation minister in the Christian Reformed Church, and of course, many of the people I talk to, the Christian Reformed Church. But you're pretty neck deep in
Oh yeah.
Christian Reformed land. So I graduated Calvin College, was going to go to Fuller, but then had met a woman who became my wife. So I went to Calvin Seminary, and then I worked in the Dominican Republic with Christian Reformed World Missions.
Hmm.
And then I took a call to a struggling little church in Sacramento, California, another Christian Reformed church. And I've been here ever since. That's since 1997.
Hmm.
In probably 2016, I start in about 2012. I was always so my father pastored a what I'll call a racial reconciliation Christian Reformed church in Paterson, New Jersey, and that's where I grew up. And
Hmm.
so I spent all of those years in Paterson, mostly around African American people for church, and then because the Christian day school movement is so big in the Christian Reformed church, I went to Christian day school in the Christian Reformed church. And so then I go to Calvin College as my father did and as my grandfather did and as my mother did. And I study history and math and engineering and a bunch of those things. Eventually, sort of feel a call to ministry somehow, but not exactly sure why. My wife is very interested in foreign missions. And so while I'm in seminary, we marry and we eventually go to foreign missions, and then we come back. And I take this call in Sacramento, which is a church similar to my father's, but California is Paterson, New Jersey was very much black and white. And I grew up very much during the civil rights movement. So that was a big deal at our church growing up. In about 2012, I'm watching what's going on in the Christian Reformed Church, and I'm thinking there's really a split happening between, there have always been factions, but these factions are getting further and further apart. And they really need to have what I was calling a confessional conversation about how do you really interpret the Bible and what does it mean to you and how do you modulate these things? So I start blogging probably around early 2000s, and then 2007 I sort of stick to WordPress, and then by 2012 I'm blogging about this confessional conversation that the Christian Reformed Church needs to have. Meanwhile, in the 20 aughts, I'm very much working church planting here in Sacramento, sort of in a seeker methodology, but each successive church planter comes sort of with a different methodology, and then people are playing with cell movements, and then people are playing with more emergent themes, and so all of these things are happening. And I really take a deep dive into Tim Keller from about 2006 to 2012. And then 2012, I'm more preoccupied with what I see happening in the denomination. And then in 2016, a member of my church comes to me and wants me to go to public access TV and do television shows with him. And I say, no, I'll just do something on my smartphone and I'll throw it on
Mm,
YouTube and you can watch it all you want. And that's the Freddie and Paul show. And that's how I get onto YouTube.
okay.
And then in 2017, I begin to discover what's going on with Jordan Peterson. And what interested me about that was, why are all of these people suddenly getting curious about the Bible,
Hmm.
who I'd seen many, many people in my life sort of deconstruct and either go into either they talk like new atheists, but they live like more like new agers here in Northern
Mm,
California, and all kinds of things are replacing what had been their Christian devotion. And what I saw happening around Jordan Peterson was people coming back down those same roads that they left. People coming back from, let's say, sort of a new ageism, or people coming back from new atheism, and once again getting interested in the Bible. And then I meet Jonathan Peugeot fairly early along the way, and it's like, oh, a whole bunch of these former evangelicals are going Orthodox,
hmm.
and
Yeah.
that's interesting.
Hmm.
And so that continues, and very quickly, I decide, well, I'm going to make a video about this because a lot of this stuff seems to be happening on YouTube. And suddenly, I was a pastor in this dying church for 20 years, and it's in an urban area, just like my father's church had been, always dealing with the homeless, mental illness,
Mm,
just very real pastoral things all the time. But for the most part in California, once people learn I'm a pastor, they really don't want to talk to me because they've got an image of what a pastor is going to do. And then suddenly my in-mail box is full of people who want to talk to me, and people in Sacramento want to talk to me. And they want to talk to me basically because I'm listening to Jordan Peterson and I'm getting conversant in what's going on with him. And they don't have any desire to join a church or anything like that, but they want to talk about Jordan Peterson. And a lot of them are depressed, sort of a nihilism induced depression. And Jordan Peterson, listening to Jordan Peterson is sort of helping them relieve that. And so
mm,
first I'm having conversations offline, and then I notice the repetition, so I start having them online, and then with permission getting recorded and share them on my channel, and that just sort of opens up a floodgate of
mm,
people who not only wanted to talk to me, but they wanted to talk to me on the channel, and they wanted to talk to other people who were undergoing the same thing.
mm,
And so we had that sort of in real life. I was starting networks of meetups around the country talking about Jordan Peterson, and these same things were happening online. Now, eventually, Jordan Peterson sort of disappears because he gets sick, and I pivot that with a friend of mine and start talking about the in real life community, calling it estuary, because it's sort of where the water from the mountain meets the chaos of the sea and produces sort of a fertile in-between space.
Mm-hmm.
And I start talking about estuary being church adjacent because one of the things that really bothered people about church was they had a whole bunch of propositional things they didn't feel that they could sign off on authentically, but they still wanted to have spiritual conversations. They didn't know quite what to do with it or where to go with it. And I was providing both in meet space and online spaces to talk about that with other people. So the in real life spaces became estuary, and the online spaces became this little corner of the internet. I was
Mm-hmm.
continuing to have conversations with John Vervaeke and Jonathan Peugeot, and the thing just kept growing. And that's really what's been happening ever since. Now, about, oh gosh, a couple months ago, I had long been reading Richard Beck's blog. And then I eventually had a conversation with Richard Beck, Experimental Theology, and discovered that he and I were about the same age. He was in academia. I was, in professional ministry, but we had been sort of having the same experiences where we sort of bumped into the emergent movement, and we had seen people sort of deconstruct through the emergent movement or
Mm-hmm.
go to the main line or go young, restless, and reformed. And we had noticed that both of us sort of were tracking on a number of things. And then on his blog, I bumped into a series that he had done in March of 2024 about why the emergent movement died. And a whole
Yeah, I
bunch
saw
of
that. Okay.
whole bunch of
Mm-hmm.
lights came on for me then because I had read McLaren and Rob Bell and was looking at the ooze and conversing with Rachel Held Evans. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'd been doing all of these things. And then I'd sort of been doing all of these things until I hit Tim Keller. And there for reasons that I won't go into, I found Tim Keller much more helpful to me than I had found all of the emergent stuff that I was reading in terms of what I needed as a what I needed for my own spiritual life. And so that sort of took the turn then into Tim Keller. But then, of course, the turn into Jordan Peterson land became very fruitful because what that did was open up a lot of conversation and a much bigger world, an engagement with a much bigger world. And because sort of early on I had, developed a friendship with John Vervaeke and Jonathan Peugeot, we started doing live events together, which, eventually sort of overlapped with the estuary stuff. And yeah, and so I'm about 6, 7 years from retirement. My church is what I started on YouTube, and by the generosity of many people, it sort of has kept my church afloat. I never really
Mm-hmm.
asked for money for
Amazing.
myself,
Mm-hmm.
but people just like, oh, we don't really want Paul having to take a call to some church that says, we don't want you spending how many hours a week talking with people who don't live in the neighborhood or will never be tithing members of our church. But this church has never put those restrictions on me. Um, so I keep doing it, and Living Stones is still alive. And my YouTube channel continues to be a combination of, like my friend John Van Donk says, my myopic mental meanderings. I'm just
Mm-hmm.
thinking through things out loud online and then talking to other people who are thinking through things online. Part of what developed early on with all of the people that I talked to were what was called in the little corner the randos conversations, where I didn't know, people just wanted to talk to me. And I had decades of pastoring, decades of watching my father pastor, my grandfather pastor. So I just approached it like a pastor, not like an academic.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of engaged people. And it sort of modeled for people what has gone on online, which is people come online and they tell their stories. And there's a lot of good reasons not to do that, but the online space has sort of filled a need for people. And some of these people go to church and some of these people don't go to church. But what many people began to realize was that they were having a different quality of conversation, either online in the little corner or in estuary that wasn't happening in churches, which is
Hmm.
part of the reason why I started estuary. So, and that's kind of, and then I got your email, and I've also been keeping up for when I got back to North America. I started participating on a little listserv. Listservs are like the pre-social media, which are just
Don't even know what that
email
is actually.
groups.
Okay.
And there's one called CRC Voices and this
Uh-huh.
is a group of people that I've been sharing ideas with and basically doing what I do online with them over emails.
Hmm.
And of course, it's much more of a Christian Reformed centric community. And yeah, so and then of course your name has come up a number of times because I lived in Grand Rapids while I was at Calvin College and Calvin Seminary.
Okay.
When I was in at college and seminary in the 80s, Calvary non-denominational was kind of a big deal in Grand Rapids.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
Seeker Church was opening up, the Seeker movement was going full steam. People growing up Christian Reformed were looking for something else. And I would have to say, one of the chapters, the spiritual chapters in my life was, you know, what's going on in evangelicalism because you grow up Christian Reformed and then you meet evangelicals and it's like, that's not Christian Reformed. And so Calvary non-denomination was a big deal. And your father's story, of course, Grand Rapids is the second largest city in Michigan, but especially if you're sort of tied into the Christian Reformed Church, which is like this massive family network,
Hmm.
um, you hear things. And sort of Calvary non-denom was going big, and Christian Reformed people were wondering, why are our people going to this non-denominational church? And by the time I come back to North America, a lot of that stuff is happening where people are leaving the Christian Reformed church, going to big box Christianity. But then, of course,
Yeah.
by the 90s and aughts, the emergent movement is in full steam. And then we hear about this guy named Rob Bell, and he's buying the Grand Village Mall, and he's going to do a church in that, all
Sort of.
while Christian Reformed churches in Wyoming and Granville and Jenison are cratering.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we were busy sucking up all those people.
Yeah, so that's when you came across you an email, thought, oh, I want to talk to this guy. So, and I want to get your story.
Oh man.
So
Okay. Yeah.
let's
That's
go. So let's hear your. And I'm going to be. Well, we're both pastors, so you were very kind. Well, ask any questions you want to ask until before I get into your story.
um. Okay. Yeah. I This might sound strange, but I kind of want to know, what post are you holding? I hear pastor. I hear Christian Reformed minister. I hear um, somewhat of a loose academic. I don't mean loose in terms of loose thinking, but there's a connection to thought here and careful consideration. I hear in the background a kind of a theological stance. I'm not sure what that is, but at the very least, like maintaining a certain of the value of theology here and how it works itself out. And that's actually a conversation that I've been ignoring. I mean, I went to school for biblical studies, and that was even though we were doing theology and pretending we weren't. But like theology was not my world. And anyway, so I hear a bit of that, but like, what post are you holding, and or what mirror are you trying to hold up to this landscape, shifting landscape of religion and the secular world or the spiritual landscape? I'm just kind of turning up the soil here.
Boy, what post am I holding?
Mm,
That's a question that I have been struggling to answer really since, I made a video and I thought a couple dozen people might listen to it and I might get two or three new friends. And I was completely unprepared for what happened, where I was getting a lot of email. And we started a Discord server and, very quickly had two or 3,000 people signing up
mm.
for it. And now you having gone through the megachurch thing know how destabilizing a whoosh is when it happens.
Yep. Yep.
I started going to Madison Square CRC when I
Been
was
there.
at college. And at that point, it was about 200 people. And it was a bunch of people who had sort of been through the Christian charismatic thing, the Christian community, communal living thing. A lot of people who had sort of one way or another been kind of burned, but they had Christian Reform roots. And so it was a really hodgepodge group of people. Dante Venegas was there, Dave Beelan was there. And then soon after I started going, had nothing to do with me because I was just a college student going there. The church grew from 250 to over 1,000. And I tell people, the people who hated that most were a lot of the 250 that this
Yeah.
mob overran their church. So there's a lot of people out there that are like, Paul, I can't wait till your channel has 1 million subscribers. I say, you do not want that, and neither
Mm,
do I. Um, I have so in a lot of ways, my father, and this is something we both share. I'll be very interested to hear about your story. So, my father was a Christian Reformed pastor of a tiny, struggling inner city church, but he was always a very thoughtful guy and always a very open guy.
mm,
And, Northside Chapel that I grew up in, it was chaotic, it was messy. At that point, heroin was going through Patterson, and so they had started a drug rehabilitation center. And so I grew up going to church with heroin addicts who were trying to stay clean and young Christian Reformed people who were sort of moving out of the Christian Reformed Church and wanted something different, but it was still the Christian Reformed Church, and African Americans who wanted something alternative to the Black church. So I grew up sort of in a kind of a counterculture setting, but
mm,
my parents were very stable, devout people.
mm,
And so, unlike, let's say, children of hippies who couldn't rely on the fact that there's, milk in the refrigerator and food on the table,
mm, mhm,
I had stability and openness.
mm,
And so when the internet flood turned on to me, and it happened later in life, which I'm glad for, I at that point had a certain knowledge of who I was.
mm,
And, I people people have long on my internet channel been waiting for me to disclose some new revelation and some new plan and some new thing that I'm going to somehow do in the world. And I keep telling them, I feel myself very much a son of the Christian Reformed Church, and my
mm,
theology is very much that I believe of the Christian Reformed Church, at least what I saw in my father and my grandfather to a degree. So I don't see
mm,
myself as a rebel in any way, but I've always also been a missionary, and I'm very interested in people, and I'm very interested in people making positive steps in their life. And most of the ministry places I've been in, that has never meant sort of in order for someone to get their life together, they have to join the Christian Reformed Church.
mm,
I've just never seen that. And I've worked with many people over the years who, let's say, start in this church for a little while. And then for one reason or another, they need to go back to an African American church or to a Pentecostal street church because all of those people are full of ex-gang members and ex-cons or,
mm.
all kinds of things. So I, I think what I'm doing is I'm continuing to try to pastor and preach, but just in a really weird place, which is
Yeah.
the internet.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
and and
that's a
that's
great
different
response.
from
Mhm.
Christian YouTube, which tends to be I'm going to grow a big channel by sort of,
Preachiness.
boundary policing and concern
Yeah.
trolling.
Yeah.
Now,
Okay.
I'm not
Uh,
interested in that.
yeah. I can feel that. I can feel that. I think that's why I was attracted to your videos. I can feel that sort of pastoral thread here, pastoral slash preaching thread. I can feel your openness, your curiosity without sort of like, and also you have some ground to stand on. And that's a very interesting comment that you achieved a certain amount of like YouTube notoriety, but late in life and you knew who you were. And I think that might summarize what gave me trouble when I went from like a college kid to so when Marcel first started, I did the music and Rob did the teaching, and then all of a sudden it just exploded. And then I moved to Israel and for graduate school, and when I came back, it was like in this, it was huge. And then before long, I was standing there, and I just kind of went from one thing to the next. And I would not have said, "Oh, I know who I am." I would have said, actually, the bigger it got, the more anxiety I felt. Like, wait, what am I doing here? Is this a calling? Is this just having fun? Is it, am I a rebel? What's going on? And it's like the ground started to sort of like open up before me, like a little chasm. And eventually I just fell right in, which was fine. Um, but now, like, sort of on the other side of that, I'm just, it's funny because you'd think I would have processed all this stuff, but for some reason your channel, and also you probably listened to that Mars Hill podcast, the other Mars Hill, the Seattle
The,
Mars
the
Hill
other
podcast.
Marsville.
I have to make a distinction here. um, but when I listened to that too, somebody sent it to me, and I was like,
Yeah.
"Whoa, what is this?" And I recognized a lot of the patterns in how they were talking about what they were doing was a little like how we were talking about what we were doing at the good Mars Hill. No, I'm just kidding. At the Grand Rapids one, and I was like, "Oh, okay, this is." I We weren't just like um, creative artists cooking things up in a vacuum, which is kind of what it felt like, honestly. No, there were some larger trends here going on, and a lot of people were experimenting with very similar things, and some worked and some didn't. And I don't know. I'm just like turning my attention back to some of that stuff. Um, but yeah, no, I appreciate the post that you're trying to hold, and even my podcast, Hints and Guesses. I mean, as you can hear in the phrase, I have a certain amount of openness too, and I'm trying to find where I stand when it comes to spirituality and God and religion and faith and doubt and um, all these buzzwords like deconstruction and so forth. And now you of course can ask me whatever you want. I just want to say something about Jordan Peterson, because the first person who ever sent me his biblical lectures was a friend of mine from Israel. He's like, "Hey, you kind of talk about the Bible like this guy." I'd never heard of him. And he's like, "What do you think?" And I listened to those biblical lectures. I'd never read anything. I was like, "Okay, yes." I got very excited. And I was already kind of a little bit into depth psychology and Jung at then, and he's just like, he's not a Jungian, that's for sure, but he's definitely reading the Bible in a certain kind of way that has this Jungian influence. And but beyond that, just the symbolic approach, all I mean, we don't need to parse it out, but I was like, that really opened up something for me in a way, and it encouraged me because I have a deep love for the Bible, and I always have, and it's been like I mean, it's what I went to school for. I mean, graduate school. Um, I have like an NIV First Century Study Bible that I edited, and which is like insane. It's not even in print anymore, but that's a lot of work. That took me like 4 years, but it wasn't work like I'm doing this for the money, because there's not
Yeah.
money in it anyway. But it was like, um, there was like a passion for that. And I felt that love affair with the Bible in my circles, just like disappearing, it's just
Mm.
like, ran right out uh,
Mm.
ran right out the delta of with everything else. And I don't know, there's
Wow.
something about Jordan Peterson that was like, okay, yeah, I can feel the passion here. And I just was resonant with that. And then, I mean, I didn't really get into him fully. But I definitely started, listening to him and started connecting some dots. So anyway,
Well,
yeah,
let's now you also, well, let me ask you this question. What did your father's father do for a living?
he was a minister. So I've got a whole long lineage like you do. Actually,
Yeah.
my grandfather was a minister. My father was a minister. On my mother's side, also
Oh.
ministers. Yep, going back a couple generations. They're all Irish. All my dad immigrated here when he was 14. My grandfather on my dad's side, he converted, which is funny. Like, I don't know if you know anything about Northern Ireland, but nobody's an atheist except Peter Rollins, maybe, although he's not really an atheist, but uh, um, he would like that joke. Um, but it's like nobody's an atheist, and it's like inundated with almost a very Puritan kind of theology and ethic. And now it's changing, of course, because Europe is changing. But
Right.
um, anyway, he converted from, I think, Brethren, which is different over there, to a Methodist. And he became like a traveling itinerant Methodist minister on a motorcycle. And eventually, like, felt called to the States and came and immigrated. And my dad went to school at college at 16 at Bob Jones. So he was in this like very fundamentalist world. And right away at 18, 19 was a preacher and pretty soon ran into Jerry Falwell down in, because the circles were kind of overlapping
Yeah.
and what was called Liberty Baptist College was brand new in the early 70s. And so my dad went and worked for Falwell as a preacher, and then also eventually became the vice president of the school and dean of students and things like this. And he has some academic training too. He's went to school for education as well. So
So what was it like for
anyway,
you growing up in that setting?
well, of course I didn't know any better. Like big church was what I just called church. I never went to a small church in my
Mm.
life until I moved to Israel. I was like, oh, this is interesting. Like, I mean, it's not that I had never stepped foot in one, but I had never really been a participating member of a small community. It was always larger than life. And so I don't know, that gave me, um, probably loved it and hated it at the same time. My dad felt like a big deal, which I liked and also annoyed me, and
Yeah.
and so to be used in a sermon was a bit of like putting your kids on public display. So I had that
Yeah.
kind of like, um, I still have an aversion to that. Like when I hear ministers, pastors telling stories about their kids, I'm like, it just gives me that kind of weird feeling like you might want to check in with them first.
Yeah.
Um, but part of that was just scale, and everybody peering into your life. But I will say about my dad, he was probably like your dad was open. He was a very open and loving person and was a pastor for all the right reasons. And now sometimes he was a bit slippery, like, I would try to pin him down on things like, you know, I called him in college once. I went to Liberty. Um, and I was like, Dad, I'm not an evangelical. And he just laughed. He just would think that was hilarious. And I don't even know why I was saying that. I probably just had read something and I was announcing some new stance I was now taking. And but that was his spirit. And um, even funny things like I heard him saying like to some friends, he's like, this is a great line of his. I tend to believe that the earth is young. I was like, Dad, I can take you to archaeological sites in Israel that are older than you think the earth is. And then he would just laugh. He would like, oh, ha, ha, you're bad, you're bad. But that kind of lighthearted spirit was really
Mm.
good for me. So
Mm.
I had kind of heavy handed religious doctrine, but held in a light way by my dad, especially. My
Mm.
mom, maybe she
Mm.
was a little more of a fundamentalist and a little more afraid of breaking the rules, but
Mm.
not him. And by the way, I read a passage in Jung not that long ago in his Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, and he says that um, I'm not going to get the phrase quite right, but he's describing his own heritage. Like his dad was a minister and his grandfather was a
Yeah.
minister,
Yeah.
and basically he says, "Tough. I inherited this. I'm working through
Mm.
generational unfinished business. This is
Mm.
mine to carry. I'm not born a blank slate." And
Mm.
I read that, and that like ran right through me. I was like, "Oh yeah, that's why I can't get away from this." And actually, it felt like a combination of responsibility and gratitude. Like, especially given I've tried to like distance myself and, from a public point of view, I left the church, I quit my job as a mega church pastor. But mainly for reasons I was trying to go deeper into questions of God and faith and the psyche and not get away from it. I mean, in my heart, I wanted a more authentic and real relationship with the really real, I could say. But anyway, I just felt like a sense of gratitude. Like, thank God I had some exposure and a lineage here, and maybe I can, chip away and make a small contribution. Anyway, that was
Mm.
kind of my feeling after reading that passage.
How old were you when your father moved to Grand Rapids and
I
started
was
Calvary?
12. Yeah, I was
Okay,
12.
so you had some of your growing up on the East Coast with
Hmm.
in in the moral majority. I mean, that was sort of the epicenter of that whole movement.
Yep. Yep.
And then you come to Grand Rapids, which is a very different place. Did you go to public school?
Yeah, I went to Rockford Public School. Yep.
Okay.
Mhm.
And of course, I mean, your father's church did well in that it was large and it was growing.
Mhm.
Um, so were you sort of a dutiful son? Is that how you saw yourself?
No, I was like a rebel.
Mm,
I was a troublemaker,
mm.
I was doing drugs and pulling pranks and making people mad and
So you're the typical PK in that sense.
exactly 100%. Although I now know, didn't know this at the time, that the rebel and the conformist are virtually the same thing. I was quote rebelling, but I was just conforming to every other rebel, listening to the exact same songs and doing the exact same things.
I had a two and a
So,
half hour conversation about that yesterday. A guy named
yeah.
Local Distance. It's just 2.5 hours. He was banging that drum. It's like, dude, I know. But yeah, the rebel and the conformist in American culture, they are the same thing. That you're
Yep.
exactly right.
Yeah.
So, where did you go? You went back to Liberty to college. Why? Was that
Uh-huh.
parental pressure? Or was that your choice? Or was it just
Uh,
the natural thing to do, like me going to Calvin College?
I couldn't come up with a better plan. So
Mm,
honestly, like most of my friends, I was big time into snow skiing and a whole group of us were really good. And most of my friends moved around the world to just ski.
hmm,
This was like in the days when like maybe we could get famous on a ski movie, So they went and tried it. And I basically didn't have the guts. Part of me knew, like I think maybe it's my own soul or something said, not really for you. You're gonna burn out like a flame here and don't do it. So I didn't apply to any colleges and it was like Liberty or nothing. And I
hmm,
played soccer and Liberty has a very good soccer program. They have a very good athletic program, but I was like just good enough to barely be on the team. And that was really, really good for me because I was no longer a big deal. I was like working really hard. I was like kind of leaving behind a lot of this. It's not like I quote turned my life around or something, but I was like, no, I don't. I want to go on a different track here. And so being a part of the soccer program and Liberty's interesting. It's like, it has on the surface, it's Jerry Falwell and moral majority and fundamentalism but it's actually just a very loving place and kind
hmm,
of an enthusiastic place.
hmm.
And it's so big that you can like there were kids on the soccer team that were like, wait a minute, like this is a Christian school? Like people keep asking me, am I saved? What do I tell them? And we would like coach them, like you have to well, say this, So,
It's hilarious.
it was pretty funny. But anyway, so I went to Liberty and that was the best decision,
Hmm,
half decision, maybe unconscious pull.
hmm.
Met my wife there. I studied English. I also didn't know what to even major in, but eventually I majored in English because I like reading and my wife was an English major, so that helped. But that had a really formative uh, shaping effect on even how I read the Bible.
Hmm.
Like I never really read it as a like containing a bunch of doctrines or something like that, or a bunch of abstract theological points that we're supposed to extract. I never really read it that way. And that helped by the time I was like sort of in ministry more officially and, working with the Bible and planted a seed for going to school in Israel. So,
So you graduated with an English degree. What'd you do after
yeah,
college?
well, first of all, I worked at Outdoor Trails in Lynchburg, Virginia, making $6 an hour selling shoes to people that don't need hiking shoes. And it was it was like I was pretty lost. And I had some friends that were going to Alaska to teach high school.
Hmm.
And, so I was like, okay, maybe I should get my teaching certificate and go on a big adventure like this. I was kind of drawn to adventure. But it's like, I don't know, I couldn't work it out. It's like every other English major, it's like, I'll just go to graduate school. And I was just spinning my wheels. And then Mars started. So the story of Mars is, I mean, complex and long, but Rob worked for my dad. And
Right. That's right. I forgot
yes,
about that.
so a lot of people forget about this. And so my dad had started Saturday night,
And we're
which
talking
was,
the 80s because
yes, 90s.
your because Rob was talking to Plantinga and Mao and a bunch of these guys at Calvin. Because I remember hearing, rumors of these things. Because again, Grand Rapids, very leaky place,
Hmm.
very active grapevine, especially in the Christian Reformed Church. But please go on. That's right.
Yeah.
Rob Bell was working for your father. Oh
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
So he was like the big deal, the pastoral intern for my dad, and my dad would like put him up on, on Sunday night, and he'd give a sermon, and then he started teaching more at Saturday night, which is like the seeker service, and that's actually how I met Rob. My dad was like, "Oh, you got to meet this guy," and we met, and really the first time we were ever together, Rob, he's really a talented person, and he's also a musician, and so he wanted to play some song, like some U2 song. I Will Follow. I don't know if you know this song from War, the album. And so that was like the open. And so he's like, "Oh, Kent, you come and sing." Cause I'm into music and stuff. And so we like did this little number together, and which is really awkward. Like when I look back at the seeker sensitive service, it's like, let's play a secular song, and then like
that
people are
that
supposed
was
to,
that was radical
it was
innovation.
mind blowing. It was totally mind blowing. But so anyway, then Rob and I became friends. And so I was in Virginia. My dad said, we're going to start this church and we're going to help plant Mars Hill. And I just didn't want to miss out. I called Rob and I was like, I think I'm going to come up, and, and I didn't know what to do. And I didn't actually think I'm going to go up there and work for Mars Hill or something. I just thought, hey, let's do something interesting and meaningful. We were really reading Dallas Willard. By the way, this is like a
Yeah,
thread. Like if you start getting into
yeah,
what birthed these places, like it was Dallas Willard. It's like, oh
yeah.
wait, we can put praxis in front of like just hard and cold ideas.
Yeah.
And what if we actually lived this way? And I was really inspired by Dallas Willard, and we carried that book up with us, and we were all reading it in the early days of Marcel. And so,
Yeah.
but in the first 2 weeks after I listened to the music, and I was like, this is really bad. And, and, I was kind of a jerk, to be honest, but I had like a catalog of songs that I had gotten from my friend Scott Baker. He was a songwriter in Virginia, actually a professor at Liberty, and we were friends. And he was writing really legitimate songs. I stand on that today.
Mm.
These are off the charts, good, religious, sacred songs done in a new way. It's all scripture, like just put to music. Great stuff. And I could barely play the guitar. And Rob said, "Well, you do it." And then that started that whole thing. And that's actually the spirit of Mars Hill. It was like, you
Mm.
have an idea, go for it. And it'll rise and fall.
Yeah,
We'll see if it works. And
yeah.
so like the first two Sundays, I'm like, you don't even know what key I'm in. I don't know all the chords. And that eventually turned into a job. So I did that for 4 years, um, until I got interested in Israel and biblical studies. And we can open that door if you want, but I
Well,
want to
I'm
say
told
something.
Rob
Go
Bell's
ahead.
first sermon series was on the book of Leviticus.
Okay, it's true. And part of that was like, let's do something insane that no one would do.
Right.
That was kind of like Rob's vibe.
Yep.
And it was like, I look back now, and it was like the heaviest atonement theology you can possibly think of. Every week was about blood. We had like fake blood, and we were lighting things on fire, and he and I were going back and forth. Like he would come up with like this ridiculous sermon, and I would like try to play like the music with it, and it was just like how are we going to top this next week? That was like the
Ah,
vibe. I'm serious. It was really
I,
fun.
I totally
Um,
get it.
yeah. But yeah, he started with Leviticus, and here's maybe a thread that I haven't heard on your channel yet. And I'm not saying this is true of the emergent movement in general, because I don't know if Marcel is really even part of it. But here were our influences. Rob and I and others were reading a book called Our Father Abraham by Dwight Pryor. I think that's his name, or you'd have to look that up. I
Huh.
might be confusing Dwight Pryor, who we became friends with the author of this book, but you can probably find it if you're googling it now. Our Father Abraham.
Oh, Amazon will,
Oh yeah, it'll.
find books. Our Father Abraham. There's one by Marvin Wilson.
That's it. That's it.
All right.
Yep. Okay. So this book, there was like um, this organization called First Fruits of Zion, This is like a Jewish roots, kind of like a Jews for Jesus type of thing. And they were like in the congregation and floating around these essays. And I'm telling you, the first few years, and this is what got me interested in historical Jesus stuff. And like what were we doing? We were saying, well, forget the Reformation, forget the church fathers. Let's just go
Right.
all the way back,
Right.
classic,
Yep.
let's do it the way they did it then, except we were like, holy crap, Jesus was Jewish and the festivals and like it was like mind blowing for the entire congregation and also for us on the inside. Like anyway, that's like it started something and and Ray Vanderlaan, I
Yeah.
don't you're
He
probably
was my
familiar.
high school Bible teacher in
Okay,
New
there you go.
Jersey. I know, Ray.
So I went on a trip with him. That's how I got interested in Israel. But like his stuff was like, making its way in and um so definitely Jewish roots at the beginning and kind of like a really serious attention to every detail in Leviticus chapter 16. Let's go verse by verse and what does the Hebrew say um, and what's the symbol? We wouldn't have used that language, but what's the symbol here? What's the symbol of the scapegoat doing here? And how is this? Actually, it is like the church fathers, like reading kind of like the um, archetypal dimensions of Christ hidden in the text. That's basically what we were up to. And, people just thought this was like revolutionary
Yeah.
at the time. So that was like the early days of Marcel, and that's how I got interested in biblical studies. Yeah.
It's so when I came back to Sacramento, of course, when I went overseas, I'm just immersed much different world. And I come back to North America, and what had been sort of I was seeing happening when I went to seminary in the 80s at Calvin, a lot of people were sort of into pastoral care and pastoral psychology. That was sort of the hot thing. And there were just sort of a few little embers on the church growth movement. And then when I came back to Sacramento, the church growth movement, at least in the Christian Reformed Church, it was under full swing. And we were trying to plant churches, and for the most part, we were just sort of taking a page of sounds similar to what happened to you. You look for some young Christian pastor, maybe a youth pastor that has a degree of aptitude, a sort of, Bill Hybels and Rick Warren are
Mm.
sort of the archetypes of this. And in a sense, you give them the keys to the kingdom and you say, just just go play and see what happens. And the Christian Reformed Church was never terribly good at this. I
Mm.
think there was a lot in our formation that really resisted a certain easy instrumentalism that the church growth movement could sort of run with. And a lot of Christian Reformed pastors just wasn't quite our who we were. And part of it because the generations earlier had this real they had a real resistance to some implicit Methodism in terms of here's this moment of conversion. Christian Reformed people we're always sort of about formation.
Mm.
And so, when I listened to your story of that you're telling earlier, I'm so glad that so many of my colleagues weren't successful in their 20s and 30s
Mm.
because it's seriously disorienting. It can be. I
Mm.
remember one of the Christian Reformed Church plants that did very well. I'm not going to name names here. One of the Christian Reformed Church plants that did very well in a very difficult part of the country to plant a fast growing church. And he had famous people going to his church. And this was a Christian Reformed church. So, of course, the Christian Reformed church at that point, as it's already in its decline, is really excited. Maybe this will turn our denomination around. I was on a denominational board doing the executive search for the new executive leader of the denomination, and I his name had come up because he was known because he had planted this large church, and so I said I'll talk to him because I'm curious. And I remember him telling me, he said, I planted a church that was a mile wide and an inch deep,
Mm.
and he got out of it. And I know when people who have been successful in that frame get out of it, people aren't happy because there's this real demand for validation that the size and success just feeds in our American imagination.
Yeah.
But I've seen, pastoring is a hard enough thing.
Mm.
And at least if you're pastoring in a small place, your mistakes and your sins and your stumbles aren't at least known by thousands of people and then broadcast by the evangelical industrial media complex.
Yeah.
You're not going to show up on the Royce report.
Hmm.
And so I do wonder about the wisdom and even responsibility that this big wave that went through in the 80s and 90s and sort of petered out in the aughts of just throwing young men at things. And we just gave, I think in some cases, we just gave people way too much opportunity than they had time to develop sufficient spiritual ballast to
Hmm.
manage.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
same is
absolutely.
happening in the internet. Same happens in the NBA. Same
Mm.
happens in Hollywood. That these massive media machines just devour and consume human beings. And we as a culture not only and celebrate it, we reward it. And then when the people fall, it's like child actors. Then when the people fall, then we enjoy their
Yeah, it's
suffering and
perverse
demise.
delight. Hmm.
So, you
Yeah.
know, I again, in those days, I remember everyone just longing. Eventually, we started calling these pastors who could grow churches really quickly. We called them lottery winners because, of course, for everyone that happened, there were thousands who were trying.
Yeah.
And when I look back at, I mean, probably some of the most important formation for me have been my failures.
Mm.
Um,
Oh, yeah, me too.
Failures
Yeah.
are so rich.
Yeah. Hmm.
We
Hmm.
learn so much from them,
Yeah.
and we get to
You know,
learn them alone usually.
hmm. Yep. Yeah, I definitely feel that. Um, oh, like Richard Rohr says, we come to God by doing it wrong. So, yeah.
So you go to Israel,
Yep.
and of course, at that point too, every area of community endeavor will have fads and fashions, and so of course, Second Temple Judaism is sort of that's the hot thing of New Testament studies and
Hmm.
has been for a while. So you go to Israel and you study. And did you figure out at one point that what PhD in the church world means is that you can get a job at a struggling little academic post and make less money than a pastor in a local church?
Yeah, or you won't get hired, actually. Like there were no jobs. By the time I said, "Oh, maybe I'll have a career in academics," like you know, all the lights were on. Like, oh, I don't have a place here. I'll never get a job in this world. But I went anyway. I went out of passion, really. And yeah, you're right. Second Temple Judaism has it's still around. By the way,
Yeah,
I've been visiting a few churches. I was living in Georgia the last year and just moved back to Michigan. And I don't know, I just felt like visiting some churches and just curious, like what's going on. And they're still recycling like 1999 Ray Vanderlaan points and in the style of Rob Bell. And that's not a criticism, but it's like, wait, really? Are you going to bring up Herod right now? I just was a little surprised, and I'm not saying that that's even wrong or
yeah,
unimportant, but
yeah.
I was a little surprised. Yeah, so I was obsessed with Second Temple Judaism. Now, technically, I went to two schools. I went to Jerusalem University College, so I studied historical geography. That's a whole, discipline in and of itself. Um, and then I get interested in comparative religion, and I went to the Hebrew University after that. And I lasted there until the 2006 war with Lebanon broke out, and
Hmm.
we were there, and we just had enough. Israel's a challenging place to live, no matter who you are. Israeli, Jewish, Palestinian, foreigner, expat, student. It's a pressure cooker. And we loved it and also wore us down a bit. But yeah, so I was just really excited about learning and there before going to Israel, like here's another little thread from Marcel. Like we started off Jewish roots kind of thing, and almost right away, through the influence of the Dominican Center in Grand Rapids, the sisters, a few of us started reading and coming into contact with some of the Christian mystics. We bumped into Richard Rohr. I went to Israel in 2003 with like CDs that, I had burned off the internet of talks from Richard Rohr. I was like, who is this guy? I didn't even know what a Franciscan was. I swear. I was like, oh, the little guy in the brown robe. That's about all I knew. And it was just interesting. Like, um, I don't know about Mars Hill. Was it a mile wide and an inch deep? I don't know. I would say those of us on the inside were trying to go deep. It
Hmm.
doesn't mean we were doing church that well. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean that the community felt that, but it wasn't like let's just throw something up on Sunday morning and hope people come week after week. It was like, no, let's go down. Let's dig down. That's how it felt to me. So Christian mystics, thanks to the Dominican Center, Richard Rohr. First time I ever heard the name Ken Wilber was at Mars Hill, spiral dynamics. And then we were
Yeah.
like starting to spin out, and
Yeah.
like sort of like, let's say yes to everything and
Yeah.
transcend and include. This became like by the time I took Rob's job, that was more my vibe. Like
Hmm.
I'm transcend and include. I can be here and include various other traditions,
Hmm.
this kind of thing. Um, Not that I was good at it or even saying that was the right approach, but that's just where I was. But anyway, yeah, Second Temple Judaism and sort of biblical studies was my thing for a while. And I started leading my own Israel trips. And when I came back, I taught at North Point Christian school. I taught high school Bible. And I got fired there because I made a program for the Discovery Channel on the historical Jesus, and they didn't like it. So it was a bit dramatic.
Is
But I
is
can't.
North Point a Baptist
Yes, it's a
school?
Baptist school.
Okay.
But they like someone had come on one of my trips, and they're like, "You've got to come back, and teach. Our high school kids would just love you." And I absolutely loved teaching high school. It was like so fun. But then I made this program, and it was like they just didn't like it. Really basic things like, was Jesus really born in Bethlehem or was he born in Nazareth? And I'm the host of the show. So I'm hosting these questions and even my personal beliefs aren't that interwoven, but it didn't matter. They just fired me for that. And then I taught at Grand Rapids Christian after that.
Oh, really?
Yes. Yep. They said, well, we don't have a problem with your Discovery Channel thing. You can teach here. I was like, great.
Ah, the
That,
Christian Reformed Church.
Yeah, actually, that's when I really came to appreciate the Christian Reformed Church
Yeah.
because I realized, okay, these there's an openness,
Yeah.
there's a commitment to academics and
Yeah.
to care and to thought, and you're not easily dismissed, and you can have some somewhat controversial ideas, but we can hold those, and I loved teaching there. Like I loved the entire staff, I loved the principal, I loved the administration. I would not have left teaching there. I mean, sometimes it'd be uncomfortable because I'm reading Ken Wilber and you're like wondering where am I really in this, and
Yeah.
I'm like, should I become Orthodox or Catholic or am I spiritual but not religious? I was like in this kind of swirl of those possibilities. And then the job at Marcel, they asked me to apply for that after Rob left.
Mhm.
And so then I left Grand Rapids Christian.
Why you then? I mean, I mean, of course, your father and you
Mm,
had been there. So were you attending there or?
I wasn't occasionally.
Mm.
So I was well known. Be, well, basically, every time Rob wanted a break, I taught there. And sometimes he would like
Oh,
have a little freak out or have something like going on and not there for 2 months. And I would do a bunch of talks. So I was like well known. I was starting to find my own groove. Rob and I are really good friends. And so I never had this like following Rob Bell. I'm sure it was there in the background. I'm not going to
yeah,
pretend to be a saint, but
yeah,
I was like just doing my thing. I wasn't trying to
yeah,
do his thing.
yeah.
And people liked that. And really after Love Wins, nobody really wanted that job, or you'd have to be kind of insane to want that job. Like, why? Yeah. So, but I
Oh,
guess I was,
fame is a fickle mistress.
oh, it's terrible. But I think because I had been an insider, I looked around the circle, I knew everyone involved. I played the music for years, you know. I still would occasionally do the music and I just stepped in and kind of with a good amount of naivety and some insider knowledge, I thought I'll give it a try.
Hmm.
And and I did kind of think even if I'm a transitional figure, it's better than just hiring somebody from the outside, like who's the slickest person that can make us feel like Rob is still here, and that's never going to work ever. So I think most people were really happy. They were quite disappointed when I left. That was my general feel of the. It's hard to tell because got to go person by person, but I liked it until basically what I was saying before. I was like, wait a minute, is this really a calling for me? I felt pulled. This is the story I have, and I'm not sure if it's true, but I felt pulled to the edges of the faith of Christianity and not really to the center. And here I am at the center of a big, you know, $4 million church,
Yeah.
big budget and I just realized like, oh, this is and the LGBTQ stuff was kicking off, and it's like you got to take a stand. And I didn't know Tim Keller, by the way, but he called me once and tried to like, you're gonna take the church down if you follow Rob Bell and all this kind of stuff. And I'm
Oh,
like,
really?
yeah, yeah. I was like, I know
Wow.
him. He was almost talking to me like as if he was like someone I didn't know. Um, yeah, so it was like it was weird. It's just such a weird
That would
time.
have to be a very strange situation.
Yeah, yeah. So Um, yeah, and anyway, I was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. You could say either I didn't have the courage to say we're open and affirming, and that's just it. And Mars was strange because we had gay people already who were serving in very important areas and no one was saying anything about it. And suddenly it's like take a stand and then we had people basically afraid post Rob Bell that it was just going to go off the rails.
Yeah.
And so there was a growing conservative contingent that was saying, if we're out of here. And it's like, honestly, critique me if you want, but I felt this is not my fight. Like, this is not mine to carry for better or worse. And that was a factor. Besides, I need to find out who I am, and what is my actual experience of God. That was even deeper for me. Like, what
Yeah.
is my experience of God? And I'm good at talking. That doesn't tell you anything about what's going on in the inner sanctum here.
Yeah.
So I stepped down primarily for that reason, mildly because it was feeling like a contentious fight was at hand. And Mars Hill went the opposite way from me once I left. They
Hmm.
said, "All right, let's double down in a let's leave Kent Rob days behind." This is my view.
Yeah.
Like, not totally. I mean, it might be unfair if there were other people in the room here with us and say, "Well, not quite," but that's the way it felt to me,
Yeah.
and it kind of started unraveling shortly thereafter. It's still around. I mean, there are really
Hmm.
good people there. I went to a funeral there not that long ago, but it's
Hmm.
a handful of people really committed.
Yeah.
They went more in the liturgical direction, as you've been talking about on your
Yeah.
podcast. It's like, what are we doing? Playing fun songs. Let's stick with the Eucharist and do liturgy, and that let's pretend to be Episcopalian. That's a critique, but it's also like it has its own power, and I think they're trying to find their feet there in that sense.
Well, it was interesting because I was just the Calvin worship thing is going on right now, and I keep an eye on CRC things, and I turn it on. There's my colleague Kevin Adams. Kevin, when I moved here in '97, Kevin came to Rockland, California in '91 and planted church Granite Springs there. And when I got
Hmm.
here in '97, this church, when Kevin was coming, went to classes and tried to get the church plant stopped. And Kevin was a couple of years ahead of me at Calvin Seminary, and we didn't really know each other. But when we got here, we had lunch together, and we knew that no, we're on the same page in a whole bunch of things. So let's plant churches. Let's do some stuff. Let's not just sit around. And so he's where was I going with that? Um, yeah. So oh shoot, where was I going with that? doggone it. Why would I? Well, oh, okay. Here's where I was going with that. So then we plant all these churches in the Sacramento
Hmm.
area because the Christian Reformed Church in Grand Rapids is flush with money because of a financial thing that had happened a number of years before. And my classis was flush with money, but they didn't want any churches planted near their established churches. So they're like, you guys in Sacramento, you plant all the churches you want. So we're bringing in seminarians and we're planting churches. And
Hmm.
Kevin starts out total seeker mode, but before you know it, it's weekly communion and it's uh, revised common lectionary, and they're celebrating Ash Wednesday, and
Hmm.
all of
That's what
these
we, yeah.
churches that we planted just all sort of gravitated towards sort of Anglo-Catholic Christian Reformed, except of
Hmm.
course my church, because I'm still at this dying African American, multi-ethnic, whatever, with homeless people. And people on the internet are like, Paul, if I lived in Sacramento, I'd go to your church. And I look at them and like, I bet you
I
wouldn't.
doubt it.
I bet you wouldn't. Because
Yeah, that's
now I'm
funny.
all nice in the state. I got my books behind me and this is all tame. But
Mm,
you watch the Freddie and Paul show every week, and you tell me if you can tolerate watching the Freddie and Paul show every week, maybe you can
mm,
handle living stones and
yeah.
commune with the 40 or 50 of us that are hanging on by our fingernails. So
Hmm. Hmm.
um anyway,
Yeah.
so you leave, which I'm sure is, and I think pastoring a large church is very large churches are very different things from small churches, as you
Yeah.
as you already said. There's hugely different things. And pastoring a large church, so I've got friends who've pastored large churches, and here at this place, it's just me. I
Hmm.
fix toilets, I lock and unlock doors, I deal with the homeless people and the things they leave, and it's just me. And that was the way it was for my father. It was just him shoveling the walk, shoveling the, it's kind of the way it is. But in a large church, there's meetings and there's vision and there's fundraising and there's facility, and it's a whole and then of course you're also, you might have had an executive pastor, but you're the pulpit star, and
Yep.
so
That's how it was. Hmm.
so
It was a
you
lot.
leave there, and where do you go? What do you do?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So this is where sort of there a bunch of surprising things happen. About this time, really through Richard Rohr, I got turned on to this person named Bill Plotkin. He's a depth psychologist. He started a place called Animas Valley Institute. Um, Originally, my original interest had to do with words like rites of passage and initiation rites and adulthood and like, of course, I was already into comparative religion and sort of and it's Joseph Campbell and starting to bump into Jung and things like this, and it's more in that vein. And anyway, these programs are like psychological and spiritual intensives. And I took my first one when I was a pastor at Mars Hill. And
Hmm.
it just blew the doors off for me. I was like, oh, I have an inner life that needs some tending.
Hmm.
And that was my first introduction to dreams. I never worked with dreams before. I was like, whoa, this is something new. And I started seeing my own patterns. Like, honestly, I'd never been to therapy. I mean, I'd been to a therapist like twice, but I was like, this is new. Just having an examined life was new for me. And imagine, like, I had a spiritual director, which was very helpful. And eventually I got a therapist. But so at this, I'm meeting this like psychological, spiritual crossover realm, and it just rings my bell. I'm like, this is really, it's like, it pulled me even deeper. So um, basically, 2 days after I quit my job at Mars Hill, I entered a year-long program at Animus, which was designed to sort of facilitate what they would call a kind of descent. I mean, it's not like you can manufacture a real descent, obviously, but you apply for it and they read the applications, and it was a good fit for me. And so that kind of held me in a kind of container that allowed a fair amount of unraveling. And I'm not talking
Hmm.
about like deconstruction of faith. That's like old news for me. This is more like, no, really, who am I? Structure of my personality. What what patterns have been feeding me? What complexes have been alive in my life? What do I not see about myself? What is the soul? Do I even have a relationship? I was into Thomas Merton, so phrases like the true self were like, what is that? You know? And so anyway, I really just tried to say yes to this year long. And I didn't have a backup plan at Mars Hill. I did write my book, Bitten by a Camel, during this time period about my experience in Israel, a little bit of leaving the church.
Mhm.
But I was kind of like working through it out loud. It's not like a book that looks backwards even so much. So I'm trying to work through that, what's been going on for me. And then somebody contacts me and says, hey, we have this spiritual-ish community in Grand Haven. Used to be a church. You probably heard of it. Christ Community Church. It was called in Spring Lake, Michigan, or Grand Haven area.
Yes.
Reformed church. And they had left the denomination. They went inclusive, and they were just like a spiritual collective. And they said, why don't you come and teach? We heard you left Mars Hill, and that seems interesting to us. So I taught there a few times, and then they said, we're hiring somebody, um, and it just worked. Like it is a spiritual but not religious sort of place, but they also just let me be me. And to be
Mm.
honest, I thought I was much more liberal than I really am,
Hmm.
because I just thought, well, the right doesn't like me. As soon as I left Mars Hill, my phone just stopped ringing completely. Just
Mm.
friends, contacts, relationships. It just was like a wall just appeared. And
Hmm.
some of that was, I have to say, was my own making. Maybe I kept people kind of at arm's length because of my job and role. And so when I wasn't needed, it just, that was the end. But that was the first time, other than Israel, that I was in a small community. And they let me be me, and I worked stuff out, and I did talks on Jung, and I did talks on Jesus, and I knew everybody's name. I taught there for 5 years. I
Mhm.
knew everybody's name by the end and knew their story and come have lunch with me. And it was like really, really life giving. Although I started feeling I'm actually not in the spiritual but not religious camp. I'm actually very religious. I'm not that spiritual of a person. Like I struggle, but in terms of orientation toward ultimate meaning and what is God, how do we live, um, convincing people to turn back to God, to you know align their lives in the deepest sense to what's ultimately meaningful. That's what I'm about, and so it made sense over time that for me to step away from that, even though I probably could have kept doing it there, because it was a very open community and open to ideas primarily. Um, but then I moved to Georgia. We That's where my wife's from. So I'm just kind of closing the loop here. We tried that for a year. We thought that might be a more permanent move, and for a whole bunch of complicated family reasons and work, and we're back here in Michigan. And
Hmm.
now I lead programs at Animus, where I started with Bill Plock, and I went into their training program again eventually. It's called the Soul Apprenticeship and Initiation Program, and it's not like a guide training program, but it has a little bit of that flavor. And eventually,
Okay.
I became a guide. Yeah, so
Okay. Okay.
yeah.
Wow. Very interesting. Your father quite famously died of Lou Gehrig's disease.
Hmm.
How was that? How many siblings do you have?
I have two siblings. I'm the oldest.
Okay.
I have a sister who lives in Chattanooga, and I have a brother who lives in Muskegon, Michigan.
Okay.
So,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Um, Yeah, thanks for asking about my dad. He had Lou Gehrig's ALS for 15 years, which
Wow.
is a very long time,
Yes.
and that's a real gift. But it also, the end was very painful. Like
Hmm.
he chose to get a feeding tube, and so by the
Oh,
end, it's just sort of like the body is shutting down, and you're sort of artificially pumping in calories, and
yeah.
it was really painful to watch. And so the the sequence, by the way, um, I in therapy and discernment over the course of a year, I was deciding, do I want to stay at Mars Hill? I stepped down. 2 days later, I started this program, which I already mentioned. 1 month later, my dad died,
Hmm.
and so it was like just the wheels just came off. But it
Hmm.
was also kind of like wildly, oddly freeing.
Hmm.
Like, I mean, ALS is the it's the kind of disease where there's death is coming. You
Yeah.
look at it every day. You can
Yeah.
see it happening.
Yeah.
And so it was freeing that he wasn't suffering, but it was also freeing like this whole world for me. Church, evangelicalism, moral majority, Mars Hill, Rob, they're all tied up. And it just like, I just, it was gone. Like, not that I mean, it's still in the psyche, I guess, but I
Sure.
just mean like I had crossed over into a new territory that I hadn't been before.
Mm.
And it felt kind of, all right, now what? And I'm really grateful, even though it was pretty hard at the time. Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
Hmm.
Yeah, my father passed away in 2013 unexpectedly. He had fainted a month before, which really put my mother on watch.
Hmm.
And and then she wouldn't let him drive. And they live in a small town, Whitensville, Massachusetts.
Hmm.
And he was going to meet with someone from the church after he retired. They moved back to the small town where my mother was from, and he was of course interim pastoring in different churches and meeting with people and running Bible studies and doing all this stuff. And went out to lunch to just meet with somebody and just talk and just doing the pastoral work that he always did. And and he died right there at the diner at the table at the diner. And
Wow.
I said, the clue for the woman at the diner who always served him, because of course she knew him by that point, was when she asked him if he wanted coffee, which I don't know why she bothered asking, because the answer was always yes. He paused, and it was like he never paused with that question. And so
Mm.
um, he he went down at the diner on Main Street, Whitensville, and he woke up at the banquet of the Lamb. So,
Wow.
it's and it was interesting because, you're exactly right about ALS. Everybody knows that this is coming, and
Hmm.
15 years is an
Yep.
um, extraordinarily long journey. And yeah, and then sometimes it's like, and then a few years after that, I had a sister. My younger sister passed away of a heart attack, just bang,
Mm.
and it's like, so then of course I go to the doctor, and the doctor says, "Oh, we have to see you because your sister died. Now you have to see a cardiologist." So I go to a cardiologist. The cardiologist is like, "Well, you have a remarkable family history." I said, "I'm not sure that's the word I would use, but so yeah, we never quite know how our own little stories are going to end,
I
or
know.
really where they go. So, but thank you for
Hmm.
sharing that about your father, because I know it was again, Grand Rapids is a strange place.
Hmm.
Probably every city is that. I found that here in Sacramento too. The networks just revolve around different things. So in Sacramento, it's obviously a very political town. So
Hmm.
different layers of the political community are attached, and it's just how
Hmm.
people are. And
Mm. Yeah.
so
Okay. Can I ask you a question here
you certainly
about,
may.
yeah, about this word metagelical? Like, what what is this? And maybe you could even riff a bit on meta modern, because this is also now in my orbit. Someone told me about that. I like when
Yeah,
people tell me what I am, but someone else told me about meta modernism. And
yeah.
um, yeah, so like, what do you? I kind of I'm asking about that word, but also like, what's going on in the spiritual and religious landscape in your view, and where do you see things? Where do you see things heading? That might not be as interesting as where would you like to see things head? Um, where, if we're in a meaning crisis, which I think we are, what kinds of things help? What kinds of things point the way? I mean, there are a few questions in there. So,
Well, Metagelical came to me like many ideas when, you're getting into the shower, so there's no distractions. Because what, I started, Jordan Peterson got my attention because I noted a lot of unexpected people once again being curious about Christianity and the Bible. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And then I listened to his biblical series, and it's like, first I thought, what's this guy at University of Toronto getting all of this stuff talking about the Bible? Maybe some evangelical that's just sort of managed to stay in there. And I listened to him about, no, he's not an evangelical, that's for sure.
Nope.
And so and then people are telling me, oh, you got to talk to Jonathan Peugeot. So I watched a couple of his videos and it's like, I have no idea what on earth this guy is talking about.
Hmm.
But, I start building a relationship with Jonathan. And then someone tells me about John Vervaeke, and he has this really terrible recording on Buddhism and cognitive science. And I start listening to that. And so I just people sort of send me stuff, and then especially the early days, there wasn't as large a group of people around me. So then I listen to it and I have thoughts, and so I just make a video about the thoughts. Then people are just sort of feeding me things and saying, "What can we get Vanderklay to make a video about?"
Hmm.
And but as the deeper I go into all of this, I should say that before I found Jordan Peterson, I found that one of the things I needed to do was read C.S. Lewis's book Miracles about 2 or 3 times a year to stay a Christian, to keep believing this stuff.
Hmm.
Because a lot of the tensions come up if you're doing any kind of, if you like ideas and you dare to buy commentaries. And the Christian Reformed Church didn't have such thick walls around all sorts of things. And so you can start buying commentaries and reading different people, and, you'll have thoughts. And so the further I get into Peterson and Peugeot and Vervaeke, and the more I begin to sort of dig into this stuff, the more I realize that, Phyllis Tickle made the observation that sort of every 500 years there's a major sea change in the culture.
Yep. We
And
were tracking with this even in the Mars Hill days. We were
yep,
listening to Phyllis Tickle. Yep.
yep.
Hmm.
And so I'm beginning to recognize that the new atheism, and it was actually a really smart cardiologist in Idaho who had been watching my channel that clued me into this. He says, things usually start to make a lot of noise right before they die because it's sort of like they're really trying to hold on.
Hmm.
And he said new atheism was really that way because this entire philosophical scientific worldview that they are perched upon has actually been crumbling for about 100 years, and at some point it's going to hit them and it's all going to collapse.
Hmm.
And where you've got people like Vervaeke and Peterson, they're beginning to recognize in the field of cognitive science, in the field of psychology, that the reductive materialist models really are no longer holding. That
Hmm.
that physics has been dismantling them. I just recently did a conversation with Spencer Clavin, who wrote a book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, which I think is one of the best introductions into that in
Hmm.
just a really beautiful, accessible way. He sort of walks through the history of the science, really the history of science in a fairly short order, but recognizing that, when they started making computers and trying to get them to see, they began to realize that Locke and the Enlightenment people really didn't have a clue about how we function in the world. Because when
Hmm.
we tried to replicate it into machines, we began to realize that, oh my goodness, we don't just see stuff. In fact, we're seeing way too much stuff. And in fact, there's a ton of filtering that we're doing, but we're doing it so automatically, we're completely unconscious of it.
Hmm.
And suddenly, what that means is that a whole bunch of reality is starting to get a lot weirder. And
Hmm.
so you had modernity that was sort of saying, well, everything's sort of straightforward. We're a world of facts. Jordan Peterson in 1999 begins his unreadable book, Maps of Meaning, nearly unreadable book, by saying you can conceive of the world as a space of objects, or you can conceive it as an arena for action. And and very quickly we begin to realize that hmm, reality is very different. And the modernists basically said, well, everything is sort of straightforward, reductive, mechanical. The postmodernists come along and say, not so fast. All of those facts you're actually implicitly organizing within narratives.
Hmm.
And postmodernity sort of made the leap to say, and those narratives are arbitrary. And if you
Hmm.
look at, let's say, the main mission of Jordan Peterson, and I don't know that he said this in 1,000 different ways, but I don't know if he said it as just so. The heart of his message and his critique of postmodernity is what if it isn't arbitrary? What if, in fact, there are deep patterns in the world that are bringing forward to us these major narratives that are actually shaping civilization and culture and all of the major
Yep.
things. Now, of course, he's
I'm with
getting a
you.
bunch of this from
Mhm.
Jung.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And Jonathan Peugeot comes along and says, the Bible isn't quite what we think it is. It's definitely a narrative, but Jonathan Peugeot, in some ways, after he had his own journey through postmodernism as he's going through art school, he begins to say, well, what if we see the Bible as a repository of eternal patterns? And then he becomes friends with Jordan Peterson before either of them become as famous as they are today. And Peugeot in sort of his biblical patterns and Peterson in terms of his archetypes, well, they find enough traction together and friendship together that, and then of course, John Vervaeke is a colleague of Peterson, but he's much more over on the computer cog sci stuff, which
Yeah.
is also reaching some also similar ends. And so what we begin to discover is that oh my goodness, this reality is a very different place. And that sort of is where sort of metamodernity, and metamodernity is still too early to actually take shape. And so
Okay. Yeah.
there's too many conflicting definitions of it. But what my focus isn't necessarily all the philosophy that's going on because I'm a pastor and so I'm much more of an applier than a
Hmm.
theoretician. I got to kind of
Okay.
keep my eyes on some theory and not be terribly incompetent with it, just marginally incompetent. But I'm always paying attention more to people than to theory. And I'm looking around and so I start doing these conversations with randos, and there's 400 or 500 conversations on the early days of my channel because at first I'm just doing 5, 10 of these things a week.
Hmm.
Half of them are getting recorded. And it's just when we're doing church planting, one of the things that we do, we'd send a church planter and say, go hang out in the Starbucks of the neighborhood you're trying to start a church in and talk to 5,000 people and maybe have a series of questions you ask them. But once you talk to 4 or 5,000 people, you'll get an idea about what's going on in your neighborhood, but you have to talk to real people. And you not only have to talk to real people, you have to actually not just hear what their chattering rider on the elephant is saying, but you have to watch what they're doing in their life too. Because
Hmm.
the chatterer isn't exactly the same as the elephant, Jonathan Haidt stuff, who had also read. And um, so I'm talking to just hundreds of people, and patterns are beginning to emerge that reductive materialism has, in many people, induced a sort of nihilistic depression, or as John Vervaeke came along and called, a meaning crisis.
Yep.
And Peterson sort of, and again, most people couldn't necessarily sort of parse out the dots or tell you a coherent narrative, but it's happening deeply in them, and things are starting to shore up. And what most of these people are doing in order to stay sane. So if you come to the realization that you're an alcoholic, many alcoholics learn that in order to stay sober, they need to keep going to meetings. Well, many of these recovering nihilists discover that in order to keep from hanging themselves, they need to go to church. And they don't really know why they're going to church. And so there's a one particular friend of mine who was from the Netherlands, who my first like 4 or 5 conversations with him on the channel were just the quintessential thing. He comes in, he found me because he was watching Jordan Peterson. He didn't know why. He just noticed that when he watched Jordan Peterson, he felt better
Hmm.
and, was less, hated life less. And so he finds me talking about Jordan Peterson. By that point already, it's very difficult to talk to Jordan Peterson, but I'm easy to talk to at that point still. And so we just begin a friendship and we just
Hmm.
start talking. And in my successive conversations with him, first he's just laughing. I can't believe I'm talking to, he's a Dutchman, so I can't believe I'm
Hmm.
talking to a Dutch Reformed pastor. He's got a very
Hmm.
Dutch face and a Dutch name, but he's like, there's no Dutchman left in him. And
Hmm.
then, before it's like, I'm reading the Bible. This is I don't believe a word of this and I don't believe any of this stuff, but I'm reading it and I don't know why. And, before you know it, he's sneaking into his Dutch Reformed, fairly modernist Dutch Reformed church in the neighborhood. And and then he's like, "Oh, they want me to make profession of faith. What should I do?" I said, "Well, why don't you say yes? I mean, what's the worst that can happen? You're shaky about all the beliefs anyway. Just keep following."
Hmm.
And, and then pretty soon they make him an elder, but he's still praying the rosary.
Hmm.
And it's
Hmm.
like, you're joining a Dutch Reformed church, you're praying the rosary. Then I've got all kinds of people on Discord servers that are saying things, like, I joined or I'm joining an Orthodox church and I do go to Mass and I do have a priest, but I listen to a Dutch Calvinist minister every day on YouTube. What's going on?
Hmm.
And whereas evangelicalism was sort of a development, if you read George Marsden, on the history of evangelical fundamentalism to evangelicalism, and then you read someone like Molly Worthen, evangelicalism becomes this way that fundamentalists, even though they're divided by their particularisms, can sort of missionally come together. And of course, the Jesus movement really cements that, the
Hmm.
change in music, the change in all of this, but you've still got a biblicism, and most of the theology is not deconstructed. And then you get to the seeker movement where they've sort of already subsumed a lot of the Jesus movement, but they're still doing, I mean, Bill Hybels is still basically doing four spiritual laws and D. James
Yep.
Kennedy, evangelism explosion, all of this stuff. And so that's kind of evangelicalism, where they're trying to incorporate and absorb competent academics. And of course, Calvin College, even though not necessarily evangelical, didn't really want to take on that label, but you've got Waltersdorf and Alvin Plantinga and Richard
Hmm. Hmm.
Mao. And so, you've got this philosophical revolution that's sort of deconstructing foundationalism, but in a very reformed way with presuppositionalism. And you've got all of these things going on in evangelicalism. And what's happened in the last little while is that some of that spirit has sort of jumped out of the Protestant container.
Okay.
And you've got, so now I spend a lot of time talking to Orthodox people. So next week I fly to Galway, Ireland, and I'm going
Hmm.
to have a conversation with Paul Kingsnorth and Martin Shaw
Okay.
and
Cool.
a
Hmm.
Dominican friar. And
Perfect. Makes sense to me.
and it's like, what the heck is going on?
Yeah.
And I look at a lot of these Orthodox and it's like and many Catholics and it's like, y'all are Protestants.
Hmm.
Now, you might not all of Protestantism, you're not going to agree with sola scriptura. You really don't like substitutionary atonement. I mean,
Hmm.
but really what's happening now is that there's something that's something happening that's akin to evangelicalism, but it's bigger and messier and broader, and it's happening. I mean, just look at Richard Rohr. So the
Hmm.
guy who helped me, John Van Donk, the guy who, really started Estuary with me, Richard Rohr was a formative influence in his life. Now,
Hmm.
my friend is
Me too.
still attends a Christian Reformed church, but and part of this is the internet, in
Hmm.
that it used to be that if you grew up in the Christian Reformed church, all of your materials would come from the Christian Reformed Church.
Hmm.
And you could sort of have a
That's
nice
gone.
sort
That's
of
gone.
Christian
Yeah.
Reformed clean room.
Hmm.
That's all blown apart.
Yep. Yep. Got it. Hmm. Yeah. Well, that's so interesting. And see, to me, this just seems like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Of course, you're going to fly and talk to Martin Shaw, and yeah, because the world is like that. All these borders have become porous, and I don't actually know where that's going, but and something about the emergent church, like uh, uh, why it died. Well, actually, I think it was much more like a seed anyway. It was just like there's a relationship between what you're saying and the kinds of things that are even in generous orthodoxy. Brian McLaren's book, these are seeds. And it's like whatever they were trying to do, it worked in the sense of the seed went into the ground. And it's
Right.
kind of like, yes, there was some deconstruction, but also On the positive side, like what are the relationships between things? What's the relationship between these patterns and theology? I mean, the fact that people are now using the word archetypes in ordinary conversation is like funny to me. It's like, what is happening? Oh, like the archetype. I'm like, what? Like, I mean, just roll the clock back 20 years. I mean, unless you were, of course, I know the church fathers also use the actual word archetype, but unless you were like deep in the world of theology, that's not a word that was common. So, in a way, I kind of celebrate this coming together. It's certainly, I agree with Phyllis Tickle when she first, maybe she was just a little ahead of her time. It's like, it's like she was right in 1999 to say that, but it's like you can see it now and, 25 years, 26 years later. Um,
And so I think a
okay.
big part of the question now is, again, as this will be a phrase you're familiar with the problem of wineskins,
Mm,
in that we've seen people sort of bust out of religious containers.
like me,
Yeah,
like others, like
but
all my friends.
but people who are sort of busted out of religious containers, in my experience, I've seen plenty of people deconstruct. I've seen it up close. Human beings need containers
Agreed.
because, it's interesting. I remember the beginning of the book, the Life of Pi,
Mm,
where they're talking about lions and they're making the observation that lions in captivity actually live longer. And on one hand, people are going to Costco and buying the organic and all of this stuff and thinking, oh, we're from the Serengeti, yada, yada, yada. Take a North American, drag him out, naked and alone actually did this, throw him on the Serengeti naked and see how happy he'll be and how long he lives.
mm,
I remember we were doing homeless shelters here, and we take a busload of 100 homeless people and throw them in this big empty space that we call a sanctuary. And the first thing that they do is they take chairs and they make little niches for themselves
yeah. Yeah.
because we
Of
need
course.
containers.
I agree. Hmm.
And for what, the church as container has, I would say, served people. It's not been a perfect container, but it's actually served people well, because regardless of whether you agree with all of the walls of these containers and their, the propositions that they embraced, at least they had a sense of who they were.
Hmm.
And one sure way to disorient and destroy a human being is to destroy all their external containers and then watch their internal containers crumble.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
so it isn't a mystery to me why people, after, let's say, a difficult season of nihilism, sought refuge in a church. And, John Vervaeke, when I first started talking to him 6, 7 years ago, was talking about the religion that wasn't a religion and economy of practices and all of this. And I basically said to him, I really appreciate the theory and the openness, and I appreciate the fact that there are really smart, disciplined people sort of out there in the world that can sort of live in that ether. But the vast majority of normal people, they need a box, and
Yeah.
they need the box to be stable.
Mm.
The thing is, that box is going to have to live with some coherence of the mental imaginary that they use to filter the world that's coming in on them.
Mm.
So it's you know this is a problem that real people have, and especially if you're going to live multi-generationally, that box is really helpful. I did an estuary live stream online with a bunch of randos who have been with me a long time in this, and we were talking about the emergent movement. And because, just like it was a few years ago, I had the aha moment about nihilism and the meaning crisis and what Jordan
Mhm.
Peterson did, now I'm having the aha moment about how does the emergent movement play in terms of this narrative, because all of those people had also been through the emergent movement, and now suddenly
Okay.
they're finding me, and many of those people are, they grew up evangelical and now they're going to Orthodox churches.
Mm.
But they're also saying things like, well, my grandmother was Roman Catholic and my parents were evangelical, and now
Mm.
I'm Orthodox, and I don't know what my kids are going to be. But part of me really wishes we had a coherent container that we can live intergenerationally in.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's a larger perspective on things, and that's one of the weaknesses of the spiritual but not religious vibe. It turns in on itself. It's like you really are, and I'm guilty of this. I know all the practices from like five traditions, and I've tried many of them, and but it starts to feel like a religion that you're sort of making up. Like you can say you're not religious, but if you're really committed, it's like, well, why am I piecing this together? Will it last till tomorrow? Probably not. Could I pass it on to my kids? I couldn't even explain it to my kids. So, I mean, again, I'm not criticizing people who are on a kind of wander because I think wandering is important, but I resonate with what you're saying. Like we can't live without containers. I don't think. I think it's kind of an illusion anyway. Like let's blow all the doors off and we'll just follow what? Follow our whims, follow our ideas, follow our cravings, our instincts. I mean, and what most people don't read in Jung is that the instincts are also dangerous. They're absolutely essential and they're related to archetypes. Sometimes he says archetypes and instincts are the same thing, but they're not morally neutral. They're not friendly, or I should say they're not your friend necessarily. And when you blow all the doors off the container, you don't know what you'll inherit.
Yeah.
And like he says at psychedelics, what does he say? Be careful of unearned wisdom. Yeah, and it feels like we're in that age. I'm
Yeah.
just going to eat from the buffet, whatever I want, and I'm going to assume there are no consequences to that, or there's nothing downstream. Anyway, that's what I'm finding at least.
And so, some people were expecting me to like start, you're going to start the Church of Vanderklay or something. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. Too many people have done that. I don't need to do that. Then some people are like, well, you're going to become Orthodox. It's like, no, I don't need to do that. That'd be the most Protestant thing I could possibly do is choose Orthodoxy. I'm going to stay in the,
have a have a big religious conversion,
that's right. I'm gonna stay in the tradition as long as they'll have me,
Hmm.
which is a really potent thing in the Christian Reformed Church right now. But
Yeah.
and so then what happened sort of around me was that people started doing what they do, which is grouping together. And so online, we've got kind of a weird community, and some of them probably after I release this video, they'll find you and they will ask to talk to you. And by all means say yes, they're lovely, desirable people if that works for you. But I also part of the reason that I started Estuary and I now do it every week at Living Stones at 9 o'clock. I mean, basically, my Sunday school died due to lack of attendance, even though people online ate it up. But here in this little locale, in this little beaten down corner of Sacramento, California, um, but then I started doing Estuary, and that is by no means a Mars Hill success. We have 7 or 8 regulars, which is about the right size. It's a
Yeah.
wonderful size for a group.
Yeah.
And then sometimes we have 10 or 15, depending on if we have tourists come in and some are church members and some are not church members, but at least people are. The amazing thing about human beings is that they will build shelters and they will build containers
Hmm.
and then part of the challenge is, well, we've human beings have been building shelters and containers for a very long time. Maybe we should help the shelter builders and the container builders with a little bit of wisdom that we've gathered over the years. And so if you're the pastor of a small church, one of the things that you've learned is, how to keep small groups of people from doing stupid things to fight stupid fights and to maybe help them
Yeah.
talk a little
Beautiful.
better together and um,
Yeah.
have a little bit more joy and less conflict. So,
Mm. Yeah. I think we need these kind of, I don't know if this is the right phrase, but I should back up and say I'm concerned about future generations, and um, I don't know why. I mean, maybe it's just the natural part of being a parent and being a human being, and and of course it's a deep it's why Abraham plants a tree before he has any kids.
Yeah.
It's like the same kind of impulse, um, but we do need like some, I don't know if it's transitional cultures, transitional spaces, transitional containers. I don't know if they need to last forever, but some containers, like when all the walls are being blown off,
Yeah.
in every direction. Yeah. Um, yeah, that feels right to me. So, okay. Wow. We've been talking for a while.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank
That's
you.
that's the way this goes.
Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. What a joy, though. I've really enjoyed talking with you, and I'm learning. And yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for reaching out, and thank your wife for, saying, "Hey, listen to this."
Yeah, I know.
I
She's
don't.
always like wanting to understand, like, where does this fit? And
Yeah.
I tend to be like, don't make me think about that. I just want to make stuff, or I just want to, you know,
Yeah.
hit record and go. And but everything is relational. It's all inside this relational context and
Yeah. Yeah.
connections. So
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah. Well, anything, if people want to find you, the best way to find you is
KentDobson.com.
okay.
Um,
So I got a
I mean,
website.
yeah, I've got a website and I have Instagram and things like that. What about you? How do people find you? I like Googling your name
Just
in you.
Google my name. You'll find my YouTube channel. The easiest way to get in touch with me is usually Twitter DMs. My DMs are open. And
Okay. That's how I got a hold of you. Yeah, actually.
yeah, yeah, Twitter DMs are usually the easiest part. Email is chaos.
Mm,
Um,
agreed.
email is chaos.
Yeah.
So
Well,
thank
thank
you,
you.
Ken.
Keep up the good work. Keep lending your voice and your stance and your perspective and your loving challenges and criticisms, and it's welcomed. So
Well,
appreciate
thank
it.
you. All
Yeah.
right. Well, I will end the recording.